Welcome to our 76th podcast for Thanks for Your Service and the last podcast for 2024. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Recently, I had the pleasure of meeting one of Australia's leading military historians at a conference hosted by Military History and Heritage Victoria. Professor Peter Stanley joins us from Canberra and tells us about his career and his books, his many books.
And joining us on the line from Canberra is public historian Professor Peter Stanley. Peter, thank you so much for joining us from Canberra today.
It's a pleasure, David.
Now, you are regarded as one of Australia's leading military historians. Where did the career start?
Oh, well, I think it started with a packet of Airfix model soldiers in the early 1960s. Like a lot of kids in those days, a lot of boys, we collected and eventually painted and wargamed with Airfix. And unlike most people who grew out of it, I never did. That I started to wonder what the reality was like. And after doing a degree in which I did a little bit of military history, I got lucky and fell into a job at the War Memorial in 1980 and have been doing it ever since.
Now, you had a false start, what you term a false start as a teacher. What led you into academia?
Oh, well, I've only been an academic for about 10 years and I retired last year. So I don't really regard myself as a very good academic. I spent, as you just said, most of my career as a public historian. But being a public historian, you need to be qualified. You need to be good at history. So after doing a degree at ANU, just a pass degree, because I lost confidence and didn't do an honours year, after I got the job at the War Memorial, I went back and did a Lit B, which a degree that doesn't exist anymore, and which was on the history of the town that I grew up in, Whyalla, in the Second World War. And then, because I really enjoyed British Indian military history, I went off and did a PhD part-time while employed at the War Memorial, which was a wonderful employer in that way. It really developed us and made the most of the opportunities, and indeed created opportunities at the War Memorial to do history seriously. And sort of 45 books later, I turned around and realized that I've had a really interesting and terrifically rewarding career doing basically military history.
And was the start with the War Memorial? You said it was back in 1980, I think. Was that the start of the pathway of your interest in military history?
No, I'd been interested before that. In fact, when I was on the dole, when I realized that I wasn't going to be a very good teacher, or indeed any sort of teacher, I made the most of the dole. We used to have a thing in those days called the dole, where you got paid an amount of money to look for a job. And while I did look for a job, sort of, I used it basically as a research grant to go to the National Library every day and did the research for what became it was the first book I wrote, not the first book I published, on the British Army in Australia. And so I was interested in military history. Of the British Army, I wasn't particularly interested in Australian military history, to be honest. But the job at the War Memorial came up at exactly the moment that the War Memorial turned itself from being a very insular, backwater of the public service into a modern museum, a modern military museum. And amazingly, they were hiring people who were interested in military history, and I said I was, and they believed me. And one thing, I got the dream job at exactly the moment when the War Memorial was taking off, and the two of us got on together like a house on fire.
And what was your role at the War Memorial?
Oh, I was recruited as I think a clerk class 4 or 5 in the history and publications section, which only had 3 people in it, so it was a very tiny operation. But the memorial was expanding in all sorts of ways. So we started a journal, and we started a series of history conferences. We already ran a series of research grants. And because there were only 3 of us, we divvied up the work between us. So I got to, as a very junior and frankly not very experienced young public historian, I mean, we didn't even call it that in those days. The concept of public history hadn't really been fully articulated in Australia anyway. But I learned military history, if you like, from the ground up, because, in the first year I was there, I worked on exhibitions. I helped to organize the conference. I ran the research grant scheme, and got involved in all of the things that we kind of invented the job as we went along, and learning both about the history and the people who were doing it and how to do it. So it was a terrific apprenticeship as a young public historian.
And in terms of your career working at the Australian War Memorial, you also went across to ADFA, University of New South Wales. Can you take us through that pathway? So how long did you stay at the War Memorial, and then what did you do next?
Yeah, look, David, I probably stayed too long. I was there for 27 years. And in the course of that, wrote books, did the PhD, became the memorial's principal historian. But it's a place that attracts people to stay because the job is inherently rewarding. I think I stayed too long, and eventually I fell out with the management, not seriously, but I disagreed with many of the decisions that the then director, Steve Gower, took. We got on very well and in lots of ways, and I really respected him, and he seemed to respect history. I think maybe he stayed there too long as well, because he was there for about 12 years. But eventually I realized that in order to develop, I needed to change. So I went to the National Museum was setting up a research center, which meant a group of people researching the subjects that the National Museum is interested in. And I had run a research section for the previous 27 years. So I put my hand up for that. And it was a tremendously liberating thing, because I started to get involved. I started to realize there were other things to history besides military history. So I went off and did a book about the Victorian Black Saturday bushfires and other things. And also I was free to write about military history in my own time. And so while I was there, I wrote Bad Characters, which won the Prime Minister's Prize for Australian History. And I don't think I would have been able to have written that book while I was at the memorial, because it basically asks awkward questions about the nature of Australian military discipline and Australian performance in war. So it was a tremendously liberating experience to be working in military history, but not at the War Memorial. And then I think directly as a result of winning the Prime Minister's Prize in 2011, the late Jeff Gray asked me to come to UNSW at ADFA as research professor, which meant I could do what I wanted. So for the next 10 years, I basically put out a stream of books, both on Australian and on British Indian military history, and then retired in 2022.
Now, obviously, I think that it would be fair to say that writing must be a passion, because you've written over 40 books. Do any in particular stand out?
I suppose Bad Characters does, because it was the book that changed my career. But, really, every book seems to be important while you do it, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. But I suppose Bad Characters stands out just because of that. The fact that, I couldn't believe that it was published in 2010, I think. And I still can't quite believe that nobody had written a book about Australian discipline. Larrikinism is such an important support pillar of the Anzac legend, and yet nobody had really investigated what that meant in terms of why Australians were so conspicuously badly behaved, because they absolutely were, and whether that had anything to do with the expertise that Australians displayed in battle in the Great War. So Bad Characters was a challenge, and it was a particular challenge because it basically said to its readers, this isn't extolling the virtues of Australians in war, it's investigating the bad things that they did, and not flinching from subjects like desertion and going absent and VD and insubordination and theft and all the things that soldiers do in every war, but these were Australian soldiers doing them, and particularly challenging because going absent and deserting, and the Australians went on the Western Front especially, went absent more than any other British Empire force. Well, that directly contradicts and conflicts with the Anzac legend, which upholds mateship as the premier virtue. So it was a dangerous book to write in some ways, because I thought, people could be really upset about this. And a part of me wanted people to buy the book and then burn it so that, I could become a bit of a martyr. They didn't do that. Bastard gave me a history prize. So it was a challenging book, but it was one I really enjoyed. And as I say, it was one I couldn't have written from the War Memorial, but I'm very glad I did it, not just because it changed my life, but because I think it is a good book.
Was the focus just on the Great War, or can you expand a little bit on the actual content of the book?
Oh, yeah, sorry. It was, its subtitle was Sex, Mutiny, Murder, and Crime, or something like that, in the Australian Imperial Force. And I deliberately chose to look at the Great War, partly because I had done several books on the Great War already. Actually, I'd done several books on the Second World War, but I particularly was interested in the Great War, partly because I knew the sources very well, and because I lived in Canberra, and in those days you could get into the War Memorial and get out records, virtually on the spot. It was a relatively easy book to write, even part-time. I mean, it didn't require a lot of weekend work, of course, but it was worth doing. I also went overseas to the British records, which are really interesting because they're not created by Australians. And I also benefited from the fact that records were beginning to be put online. So for a part-time author, online records are really useful, really important. But what it did was it looked at the Australian experience in uniform of the Great War, the Australian Imperial Force, and looked at the war in 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18 and beyond, and looked at aspects of the force's discipline and indiscipline, how the AIF took civilians and put them in uniform. And that was really important because they didn't behave like soldiers. They acted like civilians. They didn't regard themselves as professional soldiers, although they became very good. They regarded themselves as civilians in uniform. And so the things they did as civilians, they kept doing in uniform. So if in civilian life you got a bit stroppy with your foreman in your workshop, and you didn't like the way your ganger was treating you, you had a word to him, and if necessary, you gave him a punch in the nose. Well, Australian soldiers kept doing that sort of thing, and not just in their first few months. They kept doing it through the rest of the war. So they acquired a particular character as citizen soldiers. But of course, they were citizen soldiers at war. So the war also imposed its own imperatives on them. So, for example, these citizen soldiers ran up against the terrible reality of war, both on Gallipoli and then on the Western Front. And that subjected them to pressures and temptations and options that they simply didn't face in civilian life. So, for example, going absent is something that men could do, not just because they fancied a holiday, although many of them did, and then came back again. A lot of them nicked off because they were terrified, understandably, and the way in which they responded to the army and the way in which the AIF treated them was often in particular Australian ways. I mean, remember, although the death penalty was implemented in other Empire armies, it was never approved in the Australian Imperial Force. So it gave the Australian experience of indiscipline a particular twist. And I looked at all the other aspects of indiscipline, sex, of course, because they went off and got VD, again, at a very high rate, partly because they were among the war's best paid soldiers. I also looked at things like comradeship, the fact that they stole things. I mean, this is regarded as souveniring in a benign way, but the AIF were among the war's most enthusiastic looters. And I didn't think we should resile from that. I didn't think we should treat that sort of behavior as just something the boys did. The fact was that they caused an awful lot of mayhem and mischief along the way, not just to civilians, British, French civilians and Egyptian civilians, but also to each other. The phenomenon of sandbaggers. So in the camps in Britain, and there were tens of thousands of Australians who stayed in camps in Britain for most of the war, Australians would form gangs, what they call sandbag gangs, in which they'd use a weighted sandbag and knock men on the head and rob them. Well, they were robbing their comrades. So the whole thing about mateship comes into play. It's not a simple matter of Australians are all mates in war. Well, they are, until somebody gets the idea that if somebody's got something you want, you can take it off them by knocking them over the head with a sandbag. So I tried to paint an honest portrait of the way Australians had behaved in war.
And do you think, even though this may not have been covered in your research of the book, but did Australian soldiers, citizen soldiers, change a lot from World War I to World War II?
Yeah, I didn't deal with that in Bad Characters, but because of Bad Characters, I've become aware of and indeed friends with other historians who have explored that. My great friend Mark Johnston from Melbourne, and you should get him on your podcast, He's written books about Australians in the Second World War. And there's a big project going on led by Mark Finane in Queensland, looking at Australian military discipline, and Yorick Smile has looked at these cases too. And it seems that the Australians in the Second World War were also guilty of larrikinism and crime, arguably not as much as the First World War. And I think this is something that they did act as larrikins, and they did act were indisciplined, partly because they thought they were imitating their fathers who had been that in the First World War. But the Second World War, they do seem to have been rather better behaved. And I possibly because the force was better educated, possibly because the army learned a lot of lessons from the First World War. So, for example, in the First World War, officers didn't really get any training in how to manage these stroppy citizen soldiers. Well, I think they were a bit better than that in the Second. They learned lessons, partly because the senior commanders of the Second World War had, of course, been junior officers in the First. And then there's a terrific research done by Andrew Ross, who's looked at discipline in Vietnam, who's done very exhaustive studies, statistical studies of discipline in Vietnam. And that's a completely different picture, because we're talking about a regular army with many conscripts, but nevertheless an army which for 20 odd years before Vietnam had become a regular army and therefore was much better disciplined. And so you don't get although you get men doing stupid things like, getting drunk and catching VD, you don't get the same kind of larrikinism that you found in the Great War, because these men were regarded as and were trained to be and thought of themselves as regular soldiers.
So Bad Characters was a 2010 book, and like as I said, you've written over 40. What is your latest book?
Well, Beyond the Broken Years is the one which has just come out this month, which is Australian military history in 1,000 books. And what it basically is a history of the writing of Australian military history. Again, I couldn't believe when I started this, because I got the idea in the middle of last year that I should do a book on looking at the history of the way Australians have written about their military past. I couldn't believe that although there's been some academic review articles, Joan Beaumont and Lloyd Robson and a few other people, nobody had written about how Australians write about their military past, even though we've got a really busy and military past with a huge number of books. I mean, the subtitle of the book is In 1,000 Books, but actually the bibliography that I abandoned while I was writing it had 1,300 books in it. And I didn't even I put very few memoirs into my bibliography, although there's a chapter on memoirs, and didn't deal with a lot of the subjects which are important, like technical books, books about weapons. So Australians write a lot about military history, but we hadn't really thought about the way Australians have written about military history.
Now, what is Peter Stanley doing today? Are you writing again today?
Yeah, of course. I don't, because I'm now retired, and I don't have much else to do, except stuff around the house, of course. Basically, I've got a half a dozen projects on at once. So I'm leaving for Britain on next week. And when I get there, I'm expecting to get the advanced copy of my latest book on British Indian military history, which is called John Company's Armies, which is about the military forces of British India in the 30 years before the great 1857 Mutiny Rebellion. And that, I mean, I've got a habit of writing books that breaks new ground, I suppose, because although British Indian military history is quite popular, the popularity seems to focus very much on the 1857 mutiny or on the sort of high Raj period, Northwest Frontier Afghan wars. And I couldn't believe that. Again, you must think I'm a bit credulous, because I couldn't believe that nobody had written one book which dealt with the very complicated armies of British India between 1824, when they were reorganized into their sort of final form before the mutiny, and the mutiny itself. So I had a lot of fun doing that over the last 5 years, including a couple of trips to India and a lot of time in Britain, because of course the records are in Britain or in India. But I've got another Australian book on the go. I tend to change publisher quite a lot, because the publisher, basically the horses for courses, some publishers publish this type of book and others publish that type of book. So at the moment I've signed, although Beyond the Broken Years has come out with New South, and I hope to do more books with them. I've got into bed with Big Sky, who are the biggest publisher of Australian military history at the moment, and they're doing tremendous business with really good books in the field. So I was very pleased to sign up to Big Sky. And what I'm doing with them is that 20 odd years ago, I wrote a novel about the war in the islands in 1945 called The Sherrin. Victorians will know what the Sherrin means, of course. It's a football. And this book looks at a fictional campaign in the islands in 1945. But it's only a novel in its form. It's actually, it's as much of a history as a novel, because it takes the reality of 1945 and recasts it as a fictional story on a fictional campaign, New Aachen, rather than New Britain. So Big Sky are publishing that in February. But I'm doing other books for Big Sky. So the one I was working on when I was down in Melbourne when we met the other week, it's on Allenville. Now, Victorians might know the name Allenville because it's the village on the Somme in which a company of the 14th Battalion was billeted, a couple of companies, in May 1918. And a German shell came through the roof of one of the barns that they were sleeping in, and it caused mayhem. That one company lost about 27 men killed or died of wounds. They died within a day. And another 50-odd men who were wounded, some very seriously because the roof was a slate roof and it came down and sliced off limbs. Some men were wounded quite slightly, but 50 of them. So I went to, I'm writing a book which is about the night of the 31st of May, 1918, which is when the shell struck the barn, and then the immediate aftermath, and then the 50-odd years afterwards when these men lived with the consequences of the Great War. And the really interesting thing there is that I thought when I got to the repat records, which of course are held in National Archives Melbourne, that these records would be full of men talking about their wounds from 1918 and asking for something to be done about the injuries. Well, they were, but they hardly mentioned Allenville at all. The men who did were the ones who were seriously wounded there, and the rest who were relatively lightly wounded. Their files are fat, but they don't mention Allenville at all. But they do mention having served in the war, and they do talk about the consequences of it. So it made me realize that the war for them was an important event, of course, but it wasn't the only thing in their lives. In fact, a lot of the files document not war wounds, but the consequences of getting old. So it's a study. It's going to turn into a book about this violent night in 1918 and these years of peace in which these men gradually got older and sicker, because we're talking about, they all smoked, so half of them get emphysema, some of them die of TB. They all get the sort of ailments of age, which, people like me are facing now. So it's a book that reminds us that war is terrible, but wars have consequences, but also that these consequences go on for decades. I mean, I've written a book like that before. It was called Men Among St. Quentin, but this one I think is going to be different because it's about 50-odd men, and I think I'm going to get a more varied slice of veterans.
And is that a Big Sky publishing book as well?
Absolutely. The deal with Big Sky is that they publish my novel and I'd write them several other books. And then it occurred to me that I could perhaps republish a book that I'd published 30 years ago and which has been long out of print. So they're also publishing a book of mine, which I wrote about the Tarakan campaign of 1945. And for Big Sky, I think it's going to be out in about April, May, June. And it's going to be called Obo 1, which is the name of the operation. But of course, I've updated it because there's lots happened in the last 30 years. And the whole books have come out, not necessarily about Tarakan, although there is an Indonesian book about Tarakan now. But books have come out about aspects of the Pacific campaigns that didn't even exist when I published Tarakan in 1997. So the book will bring the research up to date.
And that's one of the challenges I found in terms of preparation for this particular podcast today, was that you've written so much over a long period of time, but where do people go to find out about Peter Stanley and your books? Obviously, Big Sky Publishing now is the one to watch, but is there a single source, or people just Google Peter Stanley and see where they go from there?
Yeah, I think that's the only thing. I'm really crap at websites and stuff. I created a website in 2011 or 12 or something, and then promptly lost the key to getting back into it. So it's preserved in amber. I don't know how to fix it. And I haven't really grappled with the idea of a personal website, partly because working at institutions, the institutional websites tend to substitute for that. And then there's Wikipedia and Google and publishers' websites. So I've kind of skated along thinking that'll do. Well, I don't actually think that's going to do. I'm going to have to devote some serious attention to creating a website, because I publish with so many different publishers in different countries on different subjects. There really isn't one way to find it. But I mean, part of me thinks, oh, that's all right. People will find me. And another part of me says, no, you've got to get serious about this. And so I think I should. Thanks for the
absolute pleasure talking to you today. And so I think the latest advice we can give people is keep an eye on Big Sky Publishing.
Yep.
And we look forward to the new books in 2025. But Peter, thank you so much for your time today.
David, it's a great pleasure. It's very enjoyable talking to you. Thank you.
That's the podcast for today. Season's greeting to all our listeners, wherever you are listening from in the world. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. And you can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who have served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.